Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Whitney Lee. I'm a CNCF ambassador, and I'm here with Lee. Lee, will you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Hey, my name is Lee Calcote. I'm work at Layer 5. I'm a Meshery maintainer.
Meshery. We're here talking about Meshery, and Lee and I just spent almost 2 hours having a conversation about Meshery. And if you do want to see that full conversation from which we made this lightboard together, please do watch that. And we're going to link to it in the description of this video. What you're watching now is going to be a recap of everything we talked about during those 2 hours. So Lee, to kick off our conversation about Meshery, the first thing we talked about was the problem space. What problems were people having that caused Meshery to get created?
Finger pointing, really. Teams end up misunderstanding one another. When you're looking at the same pane of glass, so to speak, when you're looking at the same infrastructure design, it's hard to be not literally on the same page.
Yeah, well, systems are wildly complex between being distributed systems and then being microservices, and then also all of the vast CNCF landscape. It's not even necessarily a failing of people. Like how do you navigate communicating what you mean across all of that? And especially for resources that were created a while ago, and maybe the person who made that thing is gone or they've moved on. How do you manage the state of things from a human perspective? So with that context, what then is Meshery?
It's a management plane. It is an extensible self-service engineering platform. It models your diverse infrastructure. Like if you're doing anything seriously, you're probably not using the same exact type of infrastructure to run your services and run your workloads. It's diverse. And so, yeah, Meshery brings that under a common, well, I was going to say a common pane of glass, but like Meshery leverages in some cases other panes of glass. Like Meshery rides on top, so to speak, and provides a user experience. It's that bringing of teams together, bringing of the lack of understanding of these various tools, like into context, into the same context.
So Meshery is big, the scope is large. Did you say that it integrates with all of the CNCF tools in addition to some infrastructure components?
If it doesn't integrate with the tool, it's just because that tool doesn't represent itself in a Kubernetes native way. Suffice to say, it's a lot.
Let's talk about how it works. And in talking about how it works, I think that'll help us understand more of what it means exactly that you're able to model these vast amounts of resources, the whole landscape plus some infrastructure element. So we talked about Meshery custom resources. And first we talked about the highest level resource called a design. So what's a design in Meshery?
To put it simply, it's like a Google Doc in a lot of respects. It's like a Google Doc for your infrastructure.
So by Google Doc, what you mean is like the collaborative functions of a Google Doc, the way a lot of people can write one document together. They can make changes directly, or they can make comments. They can make changes that don't actually take unless someone else approves them. So these are the kind of functionality that Google Docs have that designs also have, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you write in meaningful words, and words have meaning. Words can hurt. And sometimes you annotate those with a different color or put it in bold. And in the same way, Meshery designs, you can describe your infrastructure in a meaningful way. You can also include annotations that don't need to be orchestrated, because Meshery has an orchestration capability to it. That also just allows you to be expressive, and it knows the difference between that was just emphasis, and doesn't have it. It's like for the humans to understand, not for the infrastructure to understand. So
we're going to go over these components, but to give them some life, we came up with an example, and that is we're making a development environment with the app we're developing. It has a Google Cloud database, and it has Knative and Prometheus scraping for metrics. Each of the integrations between each of these different abstractions is represented by a custom resource in Meshery called a model. What is the model custom resource in Meshery?
It's like a unit of packaging for Meshery to bundle up its understanding of what GCP SQL is, or like what this type of infrastructure is, and for it to then, inside of that bundle, inside of that model, to have all these fine-grained properties and details.
Okay.
Of how you can characterize or configure it, manage it.
So when you connect to the Google Cloud database, you have a lot of, first of all, you need to know what you're connecting to and have credentials. So that part's in the model. But then you need to know what you're allowed to do when you're there, and what you can actually create once you're there. And that's defined in the model too. And then you said relationships are defined in the model, which we'll get to later. So that's our model. And then the model references components and relationships. So first, let's talk about components. What are components in Meshery?
To continue on with that example that we were using with like GCP SQL is, I'm not a GCP SQL expert, but there's a lot to that service, I'm sure. Like, did you want to run a Postgres SQL engine, or did you want to run an Oracle or something? So that service itself is vast. There are any number of engineers that are behind that, and they've made it quite flexible and configurable and maintainable. They've also published all of those points of configuration, all the full description of how you can take and run and use and consume that service. They publish all that info. Meshery as a project goes out, digests all that info, and when it does, it packs it into a model. And inside the model, like, since it's such a big thing unto its own, just GCP SQL, Meshery packages into components, different configuration portions. So if there's a database instance is like a resource within GCP SQL. Boy, it's like I have a light board over here. It's like my own.
I play Pictionary, you're playing charades.
It's two words. Two words.
3 syllables.
So it's just components are like just a further way of Meshery capturing and I was going to say componentizing, like each of the different aspects of the infrastructure that it's managing, just like getting even more granular and more specific. Maybe you're a Postgres shop and you don't care anything about the other style of components. And fortunately, as you're working with the Meshery model for GCP, this model came with all these components, all these, we don't use that stuff, so it helps organize.
Make a more simplified interface and communicate, as you said. These are the ones we're configuring. The rest is we're not looking at our particular place. So one thing you said that was helpful for my mental model is that a component is a one-to-one mapping of a Kubernetes custom resource or a Kubernetes resource. And so each model, each tool is going to have its own set of unique components. Then we have relationships. And so the relationship is part of the model too. And so what is that relationship custom resource? Yeah,
this is, there's a little bit of magic sprinkles in here, so to speak, which is, this is one of the areas where users of Meshery tend to be, delightfully surprised, that maybe is the way to put it. And that is to say, if we were to use maybe something that I know better than just GCP SQL, if we were to say, Meshery has a model for Kubernetes, just as a piece of infrastructure that Meshery is able to understand. And Kubernetes, it has some of its standard resources, a pod and a deployment and a service. And just like you had said, hey, if there's a Kubernetes standard resource or a Kubernetes custom resource, either way, that is like a one-to-one mapping to a Meshery component. So if you have a Kubernetes pod, it's got a lot of properties that you can configure. The container image and the port number and the local port. And the thing is normally when you look at that, if you're looking at lines and lines and lines of YAML, heaven help you. But Meshery then models Kubernetes custom resources, each one individually as a component. And then in its UI or in these designs, you're able to then visually navigate through those properties and will collaboratively configure your infrastructure.
I have to be honest, if I was watching this and I had no idea about Meshery and this is my first exposure, what I would be thinking is the idea of having a single pane of glass for all of my everything is very appealing. But the idea of having to go create these configurations for everything either I want or maybe already have running is absolutely overwhelming and seems like a barrier to entry. And what would you say to someone who's thinking very rightfully thinking that?
I would say I agree, and it's why, or there's a recognition of that. It's why Meshery addresses that in a couple of ways. One of those ways is if you already have a bunch of running infrastructure, Meshery is intended to and does complement your existing infrastructure. So you deploy it, it discovers the infrastructure that's there and starts fitting, as it's part of that discovery process, is it starts to fit those discovered resources into its models and into its components and say, oh, I know what that is. I'll fingerprint that one and we've identified you as the, and so it's self-generating of its designs in that regard. Maybe though, sure, you have some infrastructure, but you're looking at a whole new deployment of Knative with your Prometheus and your app and you've yet to describe that, rather than to your point about starting from scratch. Well, there's a catalog of predefined designs that both the Meshery community, but also other CNCF projects have begun to come over and publish their best practices. So you don't have to start from scratch in that way or this way. You can start with best practices. The other way is maybe you're all about Kubernetes manifests or all about Helm charts or Docker Compose files. Maybe you'd like to have Meshery import those and model them and represent them that way. And so that's another way that Meshery gets you up and going.
So what I'm hearing is there's two big strategies or two big things you can do to help get started with Meshery. And that the first thing is that Meshery can generate some designs based on, it can read what you already have running and generate some stuff for you. So you're not truly starting from scratch. The second thing I'm hearing is that there's a catalog with shared designs. And you told me in our last conversation that the catalog can be org scoped, or there's also a public catalog. You can use the catalog abstraction to share at different levels. But there's definitely a public catalog that has some designs that you can start with. That's either maintained by the Meshery community or Meshery is popular enough that CNCF projects are starting to maintain their own Meshery design.
It's the 10th fastest growing CNCF project right now. So it's the horrible blessing that is, or wonderful, terrible blessing. Yeah.
So we talked about a little bit about the problem space and how it works, but now let's put those two together. How is this helping teams communicate out with one another?
I'll say this: Meshery is it's an extensible platform. Okay, if I'm Whitney, I might be thinking, I think we were just saying it has models and you can create your own models, and there's a lot of extension points in Meshery. One of those more popular extensions is this graph-based, this visualizer, this canvas. It's somewhat similar to the Lightboard that we're sharing. It helps people just comprehending what the heck's going on out there in their diverse infrastructure, being able to visualize and see it. They might have an AI program running around saying, oh, hey, if you were to make this change in your YAML, you'd start to save money. And maybe that's great, maybe that's right. But some humans got to read through that and be comfortable that, we should accept that change. And without it being visualized.
A picture's worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And we had someone in chat call it GraphOps, which was pretty awesome. Yeah, I liked that idea. If you have a visual representation of what's going on, how components are relating in your system, then that's a really good aid in communication between people and between teams.
It's hard for us to argue over the fact that you have the word catalog written on the like it's there. I see it. We can't be in disagreement.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's part of what you were asking. Like, how is it that, this is how Meshery works, but how does it help those teams? Like,
and you told me too, as far as access goes, there are a few different abstractions to help control, like, who has access to what in terms of who can communicate where.
A quick word on that is like, is that Meshery itself ships as a single user tool, and it is extensible to different identity providers. So you can have one Meshery server with lots and lots of users, and there are foundational constructs in Meshery, like a workspace for organizing. It's like a project, like a workspace. For organizing all of your, putting your designs inside of them. We haven't even talked about the fact that Meshery has views, which is, I'll nip that in the bud, but like the point is you might shove a few things into your workspace. I was about to get slapped on the wrist there for a second. Put into your workspace, and a workspace is pretty similar in concept to a Google Drive, where you might share the whole workspace with a team, or maybe you might just take a single design and share just that design with someone. Meshery is able to offer in its own app is a thing. And then in part, I think what you had done a really good job of teasing out is like, well, excuse me, that's very helpful. And also there's this security in the underlying infrastructure as well of like, if this is such a powerful and extensible platform, if that's the prod cluster and that's the test, like how are we, you're right. Like, I'm going to risk a slap on the wrist and tell you something new.
Please do.
Yeah, which is like, people want their security their own way, or like in this org, that team is allowed to do this, and in that org, that team's allowed to. And one of the ways that it facilitates this is in the Meshery UI, the web-based UI. There is every single page and every single button on the page and every single input field on the page has a unique key, and it's just embedded into the project. And those key identifiers, they don't change from release to release. If you're wanting to customize the security settings around who's allowed to hit that button or even see that button or even see that page, there's just so many hook points, keys that are available to you.
So all the underlying tools are there to be able to customize Meshery so that people only access and can edit exactly what you want them to be able to access and edit. And then we talked about one thing I didn't expect after all of this conversation. You were like, hey, I also want to talk about how Meshery helps with performance. And I was just like, performance? What? What's that got to do with anything? But it's a great point. Will you tell us, please, how Meshery can help with performance?
Yeah, well, I certainly will. Meshery, since it's this management plane, this extensible piece of management software, like its use cases are fairly broad. Like at some point, if we're having a light board next year, we might be talking about cost management, like financial cost management, and how Meshery understands and models all the infrastructure that you're running, and along with that can associate a cost. Right now, Meshery doesn't do that, but it as a platform is totally capable of like that whole feature area. For performance, it's one of the areas that Meshery got its start on. Meshery was initially born out of teaching people a lot about service meshes. And that's in part where its name comes from, but the name Meshery isn't meant to imply like all the things. When people were adopting service meshes, and even as they're adopting any kind of infrastructure today, you can configure that infrastructure in a variety of ways. Sometimes when you configure your infrastructure, you can make your configuration highly resilient, but the more resilient that you configure it, maybe you over provision the infrastructure is one way, or maybe have duplicate infrastructure so that if one fall, like that's gonna cost you, or if the performance isn't going to be as good. So Meshery's ability to automatically deploy that infrastructure, configure it and reconfigure it, and then in this performance way, generate load against your currently running apps, against your services over whatever period of time that you'd like to specify, analyze, like do statistical analysis over that load that's been generated. That's the crux of what it offers around performance management.
So basically, you can experiment. You like, here's what I'm running. I'm going to run this performance test. I'm going to collect some metrics and have a clear picture, measure what I do. Now I'm going to try changing to this configuration. And I'm going to rerun the generate load, collect metrics, and I'm going to see whether there's improvements and how much improvement. And in that way, I can optimize my performance with Meshery's help. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. And actually, to what you had said is that between the times that you run those performance tests, Meshery will persist the test results, and it allows you to visually compare them. Yeah.
Nice. That brings me to just like overall the point of experimentation, which I think seems like one of the values of Meshery. You could just play with all the different CNCF tools, regardless of whether you're interested in the Meshery piece, at playground.meshery.io. So if you want to play with the Meshery, if you want to play with any CNCF tool, if you want to play with how different CNCF tools might integrate with one another, you can experiment with that. I think a big value prop for Meshery is getting your hands dirty and playing and say, what happens if I do this, without maybe months of just setting it up so that it's all finally in place. So now you can see how things work together.
Actually, you hit on a key point. Like just a couple of projects pop to mind. Caverno is one of the CNCF projects. Open
policy.
Yeah. And then related to it is Open Policy Agent. OPA. Both of those projects have their own playgrounds, and wonderful. And so why do we need to use the Meshery one? Well, it's what Whitney just said, actually, which is like, in this case, maybe you're trying to compare how the two function and maybe function differently. The Meshery playground is one place to go look at both of them, use both of them and compare them in the same environment. I didn't mean to really call out the fact that like maybe you're going to use it to compare projects. Sure, you can do that. What I meant to say was like, maybe you want to experiment with Prometheus, great. And then there's a couple of complementary projects to Prometheus, like Thanos or Cortex. They're like long-term storage and multi-tenant storage for Prometheus metrics. Maybe you'd like to see how those two projects integrate, Prometheus and Thanos or Prometheus and Cortex integrate with one another. But even if those projects have a playground, which, I'm not sure what percent do, but it takes a lot, it takes a bit to run them. To exactly what you'd said is like, yeah, you can come here and it's an integrated one.
In terms of what Meshery is cool for, it's like a lot of learning related things, a lot of experimentation related things, a lot of communication, visualizing and communication. Visualizing communication in that visualizing is a great way to communicate, but also in terms of the workspaces and the Google Doc kind of commenting and annotations that are able to happen. So the communication about the resources is happening where the resources are, as opposed to like in a Slack channel somewhere else where you're trying to communicate about this thing over here. So communication in that way. We saw graph ops, which I liked. I understand a lot about why I want to play with it locally, but will you speak to a little bit about why it's worthwhile to have it running in production and running at scale?
You probably find more value in it when you are doing that, in part because in those larger scale environments, that collaboration piece really starts to grease the wheels of like team productivity. People being on the if you have an outage or you have some issue in production, and a lot of the process for people today is like, oh, we've got an issue, like PagerDuty beeps us and you jump onto a Zoom call and maybe one person shares the screen and they're controlling the mouse and things. Well, with Meshery's extensions, like, no, you could just pull up your design or pull up your view, and both of you or all three of you or all 9 of you or whatever can be in there touching and looking at and understanding the infrastructure itself and collaborating in like a Google Doc, Google Slide type way over reconfiguring it or over poking at the live running infrastructure. So some of the performance functionality, it's been there from the start of Meshery. And so Intel and HPE and some other names that maybe people won't recognize nearly as much, but like there's been 140,000 something performance tests that they've run. You know that you're a sophisticated production user if you're doing load testing of your production environment. So,
I think we've covered everything on the board. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
It's a happening community, like the Meshery project. there's bad jokes that get thrown around as well, some sarcasm. So if you have some thick skin and you want to, there's a lot of tech inside of Meshery, clearly, with all the integrations. We're fortunate that it is the 10th fastest growing project. It is because of the community.
I think a project of this scope requires a really active, excited community.
There's a lot to get done. There's accolades to be shared by all.
If I want to find this community, where do I go?
Slack.meshery.io. It's happening in there. It's
Join the cool kids, or really the nerds like us.
Yeah.
Please do join us, slack.meshery.io, if you want to play, playgrounds.meshery.io. And I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing your time and your expertise. And thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you, Whitney. This is great.